Welcome back to Let's Make a Game. In this video, I'd like to do another gamebook review. This time I will be reviewing The Royal Flush by Milt Creighton from 1988, number 7 in the Sherlock Holmes Solo Mysteries series from Iron Crown Enterprises, who are the same company that did the Narnia book that I reviewed in a previous video. Even though they're an American company, that's two sort of iconic English fictional properties that they've been involved in. Does that mean that someone at the company sort of was an Anglophile? Is it just coincidence? I don't know. In a mystery story or a detective story, usually I find that I, as the reader, am trying to work out who did the murder and how and why. And if I'm not doing that, if I'm just sort of floating along, observing the story and not actively thinking about it, I usually find that that's because I'm not that into the story. In other words, enjoying a story in this genre, being into it, it means that you're sort of playing detective, or at least for me it does anyway. You're playing detective. You're trying to work out who did it. And there's a fair bit of media that has made this puzzle element overt. So it isn't presented just as a story, but as a puzzle. You are presented with the facts, the relevant facts of the case, and then it says, can you work out who did it? And perhaps the answer is at the back or it's over the page or something like that, so that it's not revealed to you before you've had a chance to sort of think about it. Maybe there's a bit more of a system. You have to sort of tick. You might have a list and tick who you think is involved or something like that. But I remember there was a series for children called Encyclopedia Brown, which were little mysteries, like shorter than short story mysteries, which usually hinged on somebody lying, and the reason that you could tell they were lying was because of some fact about geography or something. They usually said something that contradicted a fact about geography that a 10-year-old might know, and you know that, and you go, well, you said you went on holiday, you went from by train from London to Paris or something, but there's no England is an island or something, and so you can't do that. I mean, you can actually, because there's a Channel Tunnel, but something like that, right? Some sort of simple fact that a 10-year-old would sort of feel was kind of clever to know, and if you knew that, you could prove it. So, given that sort of media exists, it's really only a small next step. If the gamebook format exists, well, in a gamebook, you're playing the main character in some sort of story. Why don't we have a detective story? You can have the choice of who to question and how to behave in relation to the witnesses, whether to go hard on them or easy on them, and whether to bribe them. Perhaps you might have the opportunity to blackmail them. It depends on the genre. And it seems like that would fit quite easily and quite well, even though the gamebook genre traditionally, it's action adventure, and the question, you're not really trying to find out anything. The sort of dramatic question is this person going to survive these external threats? It sort of feels like it should be easy to turn a gamebook, to turn a mystery idea into a gamebook. I think it might be harder than it seems. This series had at least, this is number 7 in the series, so they made at least 7 of them, so they must have sold reasonably well. But I sort of feel like some of the things that I encountered seem to suggest that maybe the mystery genre isn't as good a fit with gamebooks as you might expect. One of the obvious facts is replayability. What you want, ideally, in a game book is you want to be able to choose. You want to be able to go back and try it again, and hopefully you have character options or something that make that meaningful. So you might say, well, I got through this as a wizard, but that doesn't tell me anything about the best way to try and get through it as a thief, or or whatever. You've got some sort of character choices that are going to make a significant difference, and so solving it one way means that you will be able to solve it another way. There aren't really. A detective is a detective. I mean, there's sort of slightly different types of detective, I guess, but um, the point of a detective story is not usually it's not overcoming physical challenges. It's working out the mystery. Who did it, and how did they do it, and why did they do it, and who were other people involved, and why did this thing happen if that's not to do with the murder, right? And of course, once you work that out, the mystery's solved. So it's sort of inherently. I mean, there are a lot of game books that I don't think have replayability, but it feels like even the best written mystery wouldn't have replayability. Now, I suppose there's two ways you could go about this. You could have some system where the murderer isn't the same each time, and perhaps there's some sort of random system. But then there's a question of how do you make people's responses consistent with a given solution without making it obvious to the player what's happening. I guess that would be easier on a computer than in a literal game book, because you can have hidden variables in a computer. But in a game book, any kind of bookkeeping of that kind has to be done by the player, and so you have to hide the meaning of what they're writing down from the player. And A, that seems difficult, and B, because they don't know the meaning of what they're writing down, if they make an error, it's not that obvious. It's not going to be obvious to them. If you have to write down 15161 and that means one thing, and 15141 means a different thing, it's not going to be obvious to them, oh, I wrote down 16151. How silly. It obviously should be 16141, because they don't know they're just strings to the player. Ideally, they're just meaningless strings of numbers, because you don't want the player to twig that 15161 means that the butler isn't a compulsive gambler, or whatever it might mean. So it sort of sets you up for errors, which is very frustrating in a game book, when you turn to something and you go, hang on, I'm talking to this guy as if I think this, but I pretty much have decided that. So what's happening? So there's that you can get around it that way. The other problem with having multiple possible murderers is that means if you have 6 possible murderers, and of course only one of those possibilities is going to be the one that happens in a given run of the game, the player will only see 1/6 of your effort at coming up with a clever plot. So can you come up with 6 clever plots for a single book? I mean, some people have problems coming up with one clever plot for a murder mystery, right? So the more possibilities you have, the more clever stuff you've got to come up with. And, if you have lots of possibilities, meaning lots of replayability, that requires a hell of a lot of work. Perhaps an amount of work that is really beyond the amount of effort that goes into creating a game book, and how many paragraphs are you going to have to cover all of these possibilities, and so on. Well, this particular this particular book, and I think this particular series, it doesn't try that. It doesn't do any of that stuff. There is a single murderer, and they just deal. They've just taken the road of, well, you won't be able to replay it. You'll just have to buy another book in the series, and perhaps commercially that sort of helps. If you play the game and enjoy it but can't play it again, I guess maybe that encourages people to buy more books in the series. But in terms of purely in terms of creating good art, maybe it's not a good idea. Another thing you can do in mysteries is say, well, we're going to make it the sort of mystery where the detective actually is doing normal gamebook stuff, i.e. they actually are trying to overcome physical challenges. So we're not talking about an Agatha Christie type murder here, maybe. We're talking more about a detective. You're a hard-boiled detective and people try and shoot at you and intimidate you and stuff like that. And so you could say that there is physical challenges involved. Again, I guess it sort of takes it out of the genre. Like if you read a mystery, you're really reading it for the cleverness of the investigation and the interest of the solution, the cleverness of the plot, and the cleverness of things that you're told that mislead you, and so on. And having the player have to sort of fight for his life partway through, that's not really the mystery genre, and it feels like maybe that's just sort of a roadblock that wouldn't be very interesting to the player. Again, that's not what this book does. There's a third option, which is what this book does, which is we're going to have a character. The character's going to have different skills. One of them will be observation. Another one will be intuition. Another one will be communication. And at times, they'll have to roll against their observation. And if they don't get a good enough result, they don't notice a given thing. And at times, they'll have to roll against their intuition. And if they don't get a good enough result, they don't twig that something seems off about what the person has said. And that's pretty good. That is applying gamebook type mechanics to a mystery. You know, it seems like, a normal gamebook character might fail to dodge out of the way of a trap and take damage. Well, what's the equivalent of that? Well, a detective might fail to observe a clue in the corner of the room and therefore they miss that clue. The trouble is, and I do think this is possibly, I think that what they chose was maybe the best way of doing this, because it does mean that you have slightly more or slightly less resources on a given run, and it means that you have the interest of creating a character, I guess. But the trouble is, if I say, or if I write a book and the book says, roll against your intuition, and if you roll a high number, go here, and if you roll a low number, go here. And let's say that you know that a high number is good because you've already been told that having bonuses to your intuition is good and having penalties to your intuition is bad. If I roll a 2, that's the low one, and I go to that paragraph and it says, what he's saying seems reasonable, you, the player, are going to go, no, it's obviously not reasonable because I failed that roll. So obviously what I'm thinking here is wrong. And so it creates a gap between the character who is meant to be you and actually you, the actual player. You are not so much being the detective, you are kind of watching the detective going, no, you idiot, obviously that's not right. There was a roll there, even if you didn't spot it yourself. I think maybe what it comes down to is that in a normal gamebook, you, the player, are not doing the thing that the character is good at. So in other words, I might play a barbarian and my character is great at surviving in the wilderness and he's great at combat. And as I play the game, I make decisions, and at times I have to roll against my wilderness score, or at times I have to engage in combat. Well, the thing is, I'm not good at surviving in the wilderness, and I'm not good at combat. But that's fine to me, because I'm not doing those things when I play the game. I'm not trying to survive in the wilderness. I'm at home in front of my computer or with a book or whatever. I'm not engaging in combat. I'm reading a book. And so it seems fine to me to roll a die and say, oh, well, I rolled fairly well and my character is really good at this stuff. And so therefore in the story, I do well, even though the real me would definitely do badly and would definitely die if I had to spend the night in a forest, or would definitely die if I was attacked by wild dogs, even if I had a sword. Whereas in a detective story, you are doing the thing that the character is doing and is said to be good at. You are trying to work out the mystery, and the detective is trying to work out the mystery. So having to roll effectively to see how good you are at solving the mystery creates a sort of distance between the character and and me, the real player, that maybe doesn't happen when it's a test of my seafaring ability or my spellcasting ability or something like that, or the character's seafaring or spellcasting ability. So there's a sort of inherent problem with game bookizing mysteries. Whereas in the sort of traditional way of doing it, in the Encyclopedia Brown way of doing it, where you just get the facts and then it says, can you figure out the mystery? There's no chance that I don't know what's happening, but the character does because they rolled well, or I do know what's happening, I think I know what's happening, but the character doesn't because they rolled poorly, or the character goes, yeah, that seems right. And I'm going, no, it's obviously not right. A, because we had a roll and this is the worst result, so this must be wrong. And B, because what he said doesn't ring true. There's a sort of, it's sort of inherent in the fact that I'm trying to do the same thing that my character is trying to do. Means that leaving that up to a die roll doesn't feel right. But if you don't leave it up to a die roll, then you don't really have a character, and it's really not a game book so much, Maybe you can have questions about sort of how good your questioning is or something like that. You could have choices that way, but it's sort of, it's inherent in the concept of a game book, I think, that you roll at least a game book with a system anyway, which is what this is. It's not a choose your own adventure type story where it's just your choices. I think maybe if it was just your choices, that would be easier to turn into an investigation and to represent an investigation. But when you're rolling dice, you have the choice of either making the attributes about the process of deduction, in which case you have this distance that I'm talking about, or you don't make it about the process of deduction, you make it about fighting and running away and can I pick the lock and stuff, and then maybe it starts to not feel like an investigation. Maybe it's sort of, at best, it's a detective and action-adventure story, or maybe, and that's not what this wants to be. This is Sherlock Holmes. Yes, Sherlock Holmes does engage in a certain amount of physical stuff. There's a certain amount of fisticuffs. People try to kill him sometimes, etc., etc. But fundamentally, it's really about working out what happened, and you, the reader, trying to guess what happened, and Watson getting it wrong. And I believe that maybe Arthur Conan Doyle himself, or maybe someone commenting on the story, said that Watson is meant to be slightly stupider than the reader, so the reader can feel clever, but that Holmes should be sort of much cleverer than the reader, so the reader can go, oh, that was amazing, well done. And that, okay, so that mention of Sherlock Holmes moves me on to another thing, which is that Sherlock Holmes is a really iconic character. Um, and what's iconic about him? He notices everything and he connects everything. That's who he is. And if you were to play Sherlock Holmes, one of two things would happen. You would notice everything and connect everything. In other words, the story would say, well, you notice that there's mud on his shoes, and yet he said that his valet cleaned his shoes, and so it's obvious to you that he's not telling the truth, and there's no mystery. You just go, oh, yeah, okay. It's really just telling you the things you should be sort of trying to work out. Or you have to work it out, and because you're not as clever as Sherlock Holmes, you're playing stupid Sherlock Holmes. You're not playing Sherlock Holmes. You're playing a guy who is represented as being Sherlock Holmes, but who doesn't have the characteristic of Sherlock Holmes, which is that he notices everything and connects everything. Whereas I can be Conan because Conan's really good at fighting, but he can still be overcome and things can still go wrong. I suppose it might still be a problem if you're playing Conan, actually, now that I think about it, but I guess I'm sort of doing this live. I'm not reading off notes. I'm just thinking aloud here, but maybe that is a problem if you're playing an iconic character like Conan, and he rolls really badly and loses the first combat. You probably feel like, well, no, that's not Conan. Conan sort of carves his way through hordes of enemies. You know, Conan. That's that's the thing that makes Conan Conan, or makes Conan special in his world, is that he engages in fights and always wins. And so maybe there's an advantage with having a generic character. So instead of saying you're playing Conan, we say you're in the world of Hyboria, you're in the Hyborian age, but you're not Conan. You're the schmuck next to Conan who could well get a spear in the throat. You're the supporting characters who often die, or something like that. And that solves one problem, but then creates another problem, which is I don't want to be the guy next to Conan who gets a spear in the throat. I want to be Conan because Conan's cooler, and because I've bought this thing that's specifically about the Hyborian age. So obviously I want to be Conan. This is about the Conan stories. I want to be Conan, right? And there's a similar problem with this book, which is it's about Sherlock Holmes. I want to be Sherlock Holmes, but they've decided not to make you Sherlock Holmes. I think because if so, they have this dilemma, which I've already mentioned. They make you a detective that is consulting with Sherlock Holmes. But then there's like, yeah, but why can't I be Sherlock Holmes then? You said this was Sherlock Holmes Solo Mysteries, and I can't be Sherlock Holmes. And that's, I don't know, it's mildly disappointing. That wasn't I don't know. I think maybe that was part of it. It's impossible to have a story where you're Sherlock Holmes. Maybe they could have said that you were Watson, because Watson is canonically bad at working this stuff out, but for whatever reason, they decided not to do that. Let me talk about the system. The system is pretty much the same as the one in the Narnia games, where you have 6 attributes. They're different attributes. They're more detective-oriented attributes. And you divide 6 +1s between them, so you can have +1 in everything, or you can sort of crowd them up and have some things that are +2 or +3. You can't go over +3. But then everything you don't give a bonus to is -2. So there's an advantage to being an all-rounder. If you're an all-rounder, your total attributes are higher than if you're more specialised. It does seem a little unbalanced. Maybe it's because this is a long series. Maybe it's that it's sort of balanced over the series, but in particular books you might not use particular ones. I won't say which, but I put +2 in 3 of the 6 attributes and then had -2 in the others. And 2 of those +2s I didn't use at all. So, and then the other one I was using all the time. And then of the ones that were -2, 2 of those I was using all the time. So there was about 3 that were really, really frequently used. And there was another 3 that were very infrequently used or in 2 of those cases not used at all. So that's not fantastic, particularly because failure in a detective story is not dying. Failure in a detective story is not working out what happens until it's too late. And that means if you keep that if you keep to that convention, that means that you find out what happened even if you fail. In other words, you can't fail. You can't come to an end and go, oh, I don't know, you haven't worked it out, and then that's the end. If that were the case, you could go, well, I can start again and try and work out what happened. What happens is you find out what happens, but you weren't quick enough to stop it. And that, I think, is a bad choice. I think it would be better, and it might be a bit hard to do, and it might be a bit contrived, but I think it would have been better to, if you haven't worked out what happens, you don't find out what happens. It just ends, and then that would give people the opportunity to restart without having any knowledge that would spoil the second. I mean, they might have a little bit because they picked up some stuff, but it would allow them to sort of play the game again, and it would give a bit more replayability. The other thing I want to say about the setting, and this is quite genre appropriate, but there's been a murder. I mean, you find that out very quickly, so that's not a spoiler. I try and keep these spoiler free. There's been a murder, and you are trying to find out who did it, and you are not the police. And the reason you've been called in is that if the police get called in, then the papers will get hold of it. And this is a scandal that has to do with the royal family. And if the papers get hold of it, then that will bring the royal family into disrepute. And then what will happen? Well, I think there's not, to a modern person, you start to get sarcastic. Oh, and then, then people will want the vote. You don't feel like Victorian society is so worth preserving that true information must be suppressed. But a Victorian gentleman probably would have thought that. They probably genuinely would have thought that. Well, yeah, the worst thing, I mean, imagine if the poor lost respect for the royal family, they might start rioting, or they might start insulting their betters, or, whatever. And they would see that as self-evidently, it is self-evidently worth making sure that people don't find out unpleasant facts if that preserves the current social order. And that is also genre appropriate. Sherlock Holmes is quite happy to help aristocrats cover up their misdeeds. In fact, A Scandal in Bohemia, one of the more famous Sherlock Holmes stories, the one that Irene Adler is in, that's not really about trying to prevent a crime. We know who's doing the crime. What he's trying to do is help a German, the Prince of Bohemia, which is not a real country then or now. You're trying to help the Prince of Bohemia cover up the fact that he had an affair when he was young. And it's sort of taken for granted that, yeah, this is good. This is a good thing. This is fine, at least. He's a hero doing this. And so what they do doing that in this book is genre appropriate, but it's sort of it's unfortunate because sticking to the genre makes a modern person go, yeah, but also why am I doing this again? To preserve the Victorian social order. Why? Why am I doing that? Oh, because I'm an asshole? Okay, fair enough. And it's historically accurate, and it's genre appropriate, but it feels weird. And I think it would be nicer if they probably could have, and of course in other books they may well have done. It would be nicer if they had an aim which a modern person could get behind, like you're trying to stop a killer, you're trying to, you're trying to stop Jack the Ripper. I mean, that's a matching Sherlock Holmes v Jack the Ripper is a very cliche thing, but whatever, you're trying to do a thing that a modern person would approve of. Yep, stopping a murderer, catching Crippen, a famous Victorian murderer, or trying to catch a poisoner or something. Yeah, we can get behind that. Trying to make sure that people don't think bad things about the Prince of Wales, even though those things are true. Yeah, I'm not that disappointed if I fail to do that. Unfortunately. The mystery's pretty good. It's fine. It's good. It's fine. The mystery's good. I think it's successful. The investigation, they do a good job given the problems that I've talked about, right? There's a lot of problems of roll intuition. You fail. You think this. Well, I don't think this. My character thinks this, but I don't think this. And that's a discrepancy, but I think that's inherent in what they were trying to do. I don't think it's because they did a bad job. It's just because having a mental gap. I'm quite happy to believe that my character has a different name, doesn't look like me, and can cast spells, and I can't, and can speak languages that I can't speak. But having them think a thing that I don't think, based on the same stimulus, that feels wrong in a different way. I don't know why, but the latter is just harder to accept for me. But they do a pretty good job with what they've decided to do. There is one bad bit of design that I want to call out. There's a bit sort of in the middle where you go to Sherlock Holmes and say, well, here's what I've found out. And they go through every possible thing that you might have found out. They say, oh, did you find anything in this particular location? If you have clue number C marked, then go to this. If not, go here. And it goes through every one, but I don't think any of those branches make any difference. And so there's like 5 or 6 of them, and you could have summed it up by saying, you tell Sherlock Holmes what you have found out. And it sort of feels like that's a thing that they did because that's a thing that they do in these books. Similar things seem to happen in the Narnia book that I played, so maybe it was a sort of house structure that this is how these game books are done. But it really isn't. It's taking up a lot of paragraphs, and it's not really giving me any choices, and it's not really advancing the story. So, I felt like that was a bad bit of design. Most of the design is pretty good. There is a mistake. There is the way it works is that you have decisions and clues and something else, and each of them has a letter or a number, and you make particular choices, and it says, all right, write down clue K or something like that, and then later on it'll ask you if you've got that clue. There is at least one case where you're not told to write down the decision, and so when I was talking to Sherlock Holmes, he said, oh, you were very silly not to talk to this person. And I thought, yeah, but I did though. And I went back and it was, there was a mistake. They hadn't told me to write down the thing that would have triggered Sherlock Holmes saying, well, you were right to talk to this. I mean, whatever. I didn't go to that paragraph. But yeah, so there's at least one mistake. It's a mistake in a bit that doesn't alter the story. It's a mistake in a bit that I would have cut out. So it's not vital to the plot. But yeah, it is annoying. It's weird. It's weird when you go, well, you were wrong to not do this. Yeah, but I did do it. It also, this sequence that I'm talking about, where you're talking to Sherlock Holmes, it's also sort of, because Sherlock Holmes is a great detective and he always joins the dots, right? That's who he is. And so it's basically Sherlock Holmes explaining why you're not as good a detective as him. And boils down to Sherlock Holmes going, yeah, I don't think that's right, mate. Um, so it's like a game book where you are you are a detective who's not good enough. Almost, it's like you go to Sherlock Holmes and he will tell you all the things you did wrong, which is inevitable when you're going to Sherlock Holmes because that's what he does. He tells people the things that he tells people the mistakes they've made, basically, and he explains how he hasn't made them. And that's fine when you're just reading about him saying it to other people. It's not as fun when he's saying it to someone who's meant to be you, I guess. So again, there's a bit of a problem with, do I play Sherlock Holmes? Well, there's problems with that, like I've discussed. Do I play someone who's not Sherlock Holmes? Well, then that's probably going to end up with Sherlock Holmes kind of lecturing me, unfortunately. There's problems with the idea. It seems like this is the theme of my review. It seemed like a really good idea to match the detective story, which people are already actively trying to work out the mystery. Well, why don't we make it a game book? Why don't we make them a character in the story? Yeah, it seems like a good idea, but it's not as good an idea as it sounds. This has 505 paragraphs. That's pretty good. That's more than a fighting fantasy. It's quite a good length. Again, it seems quicker to get through it. Maybe I'm just misremembering fighting fantasy. Maybe I'm just misremembering them as really long. But I guess because there's lots of people you can talk to and stuff, those 500 are not filled in. You won't sort of see a lot of the different paragraphs, maybe. The art is not great. The main character, the you, looks very modern. Well, he doesn't look modern, like he doesn't look like he's from around now or even from the 80s, but he looks like he's from later than the Victorian period. He looks like he's from somewhere around the 30s to the 50s or maybe even the 60s. Mainly because he doesn't have facial hair and he's not wearing a hat. And when you have a man formally dressed who's not wearing a hat and doesn't have facial hair, he mainly he could be anywhere from the 30s, he could be anywhere from the 40s to, I mean, yes, suits change, of course, but you don't look Victorian, right? Put a moustache and mutton chops on a guy, he looks Victorian, or like a modern hipster, but then that would be indicated by other clothing. But if he's wearing a suit and facial hair, he's probably going to look Victorian. But they didn't do that. They went with no facial hair. I've found that they sometimes do that in TV shows and stuff because they want the hero to look more modern, as in they want the hero to look like someone from around the time it was recorded, and so they make him look more modern. But it doesn't really work for me. I'd rather have people who look like they're from the period, and especially because they often have authentic. Everyone else looks authentic, but just the main character seems to have dropped in from the 90s or whenever it was made. They do that a little bit. I think the other characters look more Victorian on the whole. But yeah, I mean, they're just line drawings. They're not particularly great. I don't know. I don't really, unless the art is really great. That's not a big thing for me. So that wasn't a big problem for me either. But they don't. Some mystery type media will make some of the clues be in the pictures, and in that case, of course, the pictures are important. But they didn't do it with this, so it's not. I think I would sum this up by saying they did they did a pretty good job with a format that wasn't as good for a game book as you might think. Actually, sorry, I'll take a step back. There's one more thing I want to say. They have authentic money, and money in the Victorian period made absolutely no sense. Sorry, that wasn't intended to be a pun. You had a shilling, which is 12 pence, a guinea, which is 21 shillings, so whatever 21 times 12 pennies is. But you also have pounds, which are 20 shillings. So you have guineas and pounds that are almost, but not quite, the same thing. And they say, oh, you start with this amount of money, and it's like something quite complex. Oh, it's 20p, 12 shillings, 8 guineas, and £6. Write that down because you'll need to spend money throughout the book. No, you won't, or at least I didn't. I don't think there was a single point where I had to spend money. That might be a series thing. Maybe it's like in some of, maybe it's just the same introduction for all the books in the series, and in some of the books, how much money you have is really important. But in this one, it is not important. In fact, it does not come up, and I think, you know, match what you're told with what happens. Match the instructions to what happens. If you're going to use money, if you're going to tell them that they will need to keep track of their money, make sure that they do need to keep track of their money, or conversely, that you don't tell them they need to. And I think it's a step too far to go down to the levels of guineas versus shillings versus pounds. Like just tell me, just have it in pounds. You know, it's probably fine. And maybe you'd say, yeah, but that wouldn't cost £1. That would only be, you know, that would only be a shilling, or have a number of shillings maybe, if that's going to be easier. Having authentic money, I think, was a step too far, and sort of particularly galling because it didn't actually come up. So getting back to what I was saying before I had that thought, I think they did the best they could with an idea, which is, let's apply the detective genre to game books, and in particular Sherlock Holmes is an iconic character who's in the public domain, so let's have a Sherlock Holmes mystery. I feel like they did the best they could with that idea, but I feel like it's actually not a good idea. It's an idea that seems like a good idea, but isn't. Well, they got at least 7 books out of it, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people really liked it. But yeah, I felt like they were doing pretty well, but it's just sort of, there's inherent problems with the idea. And I guess that's, you know, the one sentence summary of what I think about this book is that. Well, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.